Well, thank you very much. I think we are all looking forward to this, and we thank you for your great wishes for the competition in 2022. Our panel discussion today, I think everybody would agree that the COVID-19 pandemic has brought unprecedented disruption to education. I think we heard some figures from Mr. Chris Humphreys, and the Minister also mentioned the need for all of us to work together. This disruption is threatening to affect an entire generation of future workers, but the restrictions have also encouraged innovative approaches and solutions that could guide the road to a more inclusive recovery. So during this session, we want to look at the learnings of the past year and also shed some light on the skill set needed to build a resilient future. In WorldSkills, we're passionate about young people, and we have with us Ivy this morning. Ivy is a young professional at the beginning of a professional career, and a promising career at that, and then the pandemic hit. So Ivy, I would like to ask you, how have you experienced the pandemic personally, and how do you think this will affect your career path in the future?
Well, thank you. I'm Ivy Chen, and I was a competitor competed in WorldSkills Abu Dhabi 2017. My skill is restaurant service, and it is exciting to be 1 year away from welcoming you all to my hometown, Shanghai, for the next WorldSkills competition. Okay, so now next I'm gonna speak in Chinese, so please make sure you have switched the channel, and thank you.
Over the past year, 2020, the COVID hit us by surprise. However, pandemic raised the importance of professional expertise. Yes, I participated in the restaurant service in competition, but I am a flight attendant in Air Eastern. It goes without saying that the pandemic exerted negative impacts to all industry. Well, luckily, thanks to the WorldSkills competition, I got a lot of skills. They gave me a sense of confidence and calmness. It also gives me the courage to embrace all the challenges. As a member of the WorldSkills Champion Trust, at the eve of the WSC 2022, I would like to welcome all the competitors from all over the world. I know that many of you come to Shanghai for the first time. I would like to show you around the Chinese cultures with some scenic spots and have a taste of the warm hospitality of the Chinese people. As our president mentioned in the countdown event, the year 2021 is a year of innovation. The pandemic slowed our paces, while it by no means compromised our enthusiasm to embrace this world. It motivated us to innovate and try something new. We will be courageous, we will be bold. Only in this way can we embrace infinite possibilities of the life. I will continue with my career of skills and become stronger in future. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Ivy. It's great to see that our young people have a lot of resilience. I would now like to turn to Mr. Nicolas Schmit, European Commissioner for Jobs. As we just mentioned, hopefully the world is coming out of a period of uncertainty and major transformation. What are the main challenges in Europe, and especially for the European Commission, to be more precise, to help consolidate this recovery, especially in regards to young people like Ivy? What are your plans in that respect, Nicolas?
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, dear participants, dear Director General, dear Guy, dear friends. First, I'm very pleased to participate in the opening plenary of this WorldSkills Conference 2021, which takes place in Shanghai. As you mentioned already, skills are at the center of the recovery. They are a major tool to promote quality jobs, to open good opportunities to millions of young people. And we can only build a more resilient economy and a more resilient society through investing more in people's skills. COVID-19 hit young people particularly hard. Many of them faced interruptions in education, loss of jobs, or temporary unemployment, as well as major disruptions of their social lives. Our immediate concern was the impact of the pandemic on young people's education, training, and job prospects. We risk having a new lost generation. Our response has been forceful and effective. The Commission adopted a reinforced youth guarantee, helped Member States direct more funding to youth employment support measures, such as hiring subsidies, measures to make vocational education and training more attractive, support for apprenticeships, especially to companies having apprentices and keeping their apprentices, and focus on more vulnerable people. Thanks to these measures, youth unemployment is now decreasing again. Now we need to move beyond the COVID-19 pandemic and prepare our societies to address future challenges. The vast pace of climate change means that we are the last generation that can still act in time. We need highly skilled citizens to accompany the digital transformation and to reach climate neutrality. To meet the needs of the 21st century beyond the pandemic, society needs to upskill and reskill continuously and gain the necessary knowledge, skills, and attitudes. Working life in Europe is being radically transformed by digitalization, globalization, and the growth of the services sector. New forms of work emerge on digital platforms and the collaborative economy. Skills are, in the context of the green transition, absolutely key. Low carbon technologies will require enhanced technical skills in recycling, water management, or renewable energy that we simply do not yet have, or at least not in sufficient numbers. This means that people will need to learn new skills throughout their working lives. For this purpose, the EU is dedicating significant funds to skills and to vocational education and training through various instruments, such as the European Social Fund Plus and the vast program of Next Generation EU. The ESF represents the main EU fund for investing in human capital, with around 100 billion earmarked for opportunities for upskilling and reskilling, while the Recovery and Resilience Facility at the heart of the Next Generation EU will provide around 800 billion euro to support member states' investments and reforms, including in the areas of skills and vocational training. Everyone should have access to attractive, innovative, and inclusive learning programs at all ages. That is why the right to lifelong learning is prominently enshrined in the first principle of the European Pillar of Social Rights. Consequently, one of the 3 targets set in the European Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan adopted in May in Porto by the European Union is for 60% of working age adults to participate in training once a year by 2030. However, when we look at the last available data from 2016, we see that only 37% of adults participated in learning every year. Moreover, the workforce in the EU seems to lack sufficient digital skills. More than 40% of adults in Europe do not have basic digital skills. We will need a comprehensive approach to remove barriers that prevent adults from participating in lifelong learning. This is the objective of the upcoming initiative on individual learning accounts, which can make training accessible to all, and on a European approach for micro-credentials, which can help recognize the outcomes of short learning experience in order to address specific upskilling and reskilling needs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Schmidt. It's very interesting to hear what the European Commission has planned, and there's definitely strengths in numbers in countries being able to work together. But I think we've also seen in the news that the pandemic has hit poor country the hardest. So I would like to turn now to Mr. Guy Ryder from the National Labour Organisations. You've got a global perspective on how the recovery is currently working. What are the lessons coming out of this crisis that you can see from your global perspective?
Well, thank you very much, and my greetings to all participants. Thank you for inviting us to take part in this important conference. Well, let me just start from where other speakers left off. We've heard about the dramatic impact of the crisis on training and education. Let me give you a feeling for how severe the hit has been for the world of work. In 2020, the equivalent of 255 million full-time jobs were destroyed by the pandemic, and that represents a hit to the world of work 4 times more severe than what the financial crisis did in 2008, 2009. So let's start from the understanding that we're coming back, we're recovering from a very dark and a very difficult place. And as you indicated, behind the aggregate figures, it's quite clear that the poorest countries and also the most disadvantaged within countries were hit hardest by this impact. And yet, yes, if you look at the aggregate figures, the global economy seems to be fighting back, doesn't it? There is healthy growth being recorded in 2021. But let's just look a little bit more closely at what's going on in the global economy right now. The first thing to say is we're seeing an extraordinarily fragile and unequal recovery process. Fragile because we're still living with enormous uncertainties, not just those inherent in the evolution of the pandemic, which has demonstrated its unpredictability, its ability to last for longer than we would hope, but also because of a lot of the downside risks, as the economists would say. We're seeing supply chains a bit blocked up. We're seeing hesitancy in different areas of economic activity. But the unevenness is more than that. What we're seeing is effectively the rich world bouncing back quickly. On current trajectories, we'll see the advanced countries and indeed China bouncing back to pre-pandemic levels pretty fast. The same is not true of the developing and the emerging world. Basically, they are flatlining. They are not growing at all. Why is that? Well, there are 2 very obvious explanations. One has to do with uneven vaccination rollout. The other has to do with unequal fiscal space. That is to say, well, some of our economies have been able, and they've done a remarkable job, to invest very heavily in getting economies going again. The same is not true of other countries, and there are about 60 countries today which seem to be heading towards situations of debt crisis or extreme debt stress. The lesson there is we need international cooperation to pull the global economy as a whole out of this. How does all of this relate to skills? Well, the point I want to make is, as previous speakers have indicated, skills, investment in skills and in lifelong learning. I think what Nicholas Schmidt has said about lifelong learning is crucially important. This is a very important part of the future. But there are other variables that we have to work on as well. And we have to make skills, reskilling, upskilling a part of a much broader sphere of collaboration in terms of recovery. I do want to just sort of focus in on the situation of young people. Young people, along with women, were perhaps the most badly affected demographics of this crisis. Young people, their employment went down by about over 8% during the crisis. The overall adult population, the equivalent figure was 3.7%. And the question is, how do we get those young people back into the labour market. Some are unemployed and looking for work. Some have simply become inactive. They've given up. They've become discouraged. And I think particular efforts need to be made to make sure that those people, often this famous NEET population, people neither in education or employment, these people have to represent, I think, a priority in our joint efforts to recover from the pandemic. So not a very encouraging picture, but I think it's one that should not discourage us, but one that should drive us to greater efforts in this most difficult moment in the situation of the global economy. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Scary indeed, but I guess we could say it can only get better if we all pull our sleeves up and work towards that. Bernardo Calzia-Sarmiento from UNIDO, I'd like to turn to you as well, because we've heard a perspective from the EU, we've heard a more global perspective around the labour market. UNIDO is a specialized agency of the United Nations that promotes industrial development for poverty reduction, inclusive globalization, and environmental sustainability. I guess your work has been impacted as well enormously by the pandemic. Could you tell us, as the others have done, what you see the role of UNIDO being to contribute to this recovery and improve the situation?
Thank you, Laurence. Thank you, WorldSkills International, for having me, for having UNIDO today with you. Greetings to everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. Indeed, the pandemic has had a devastating impact on industry as well. It has been all over, but industry decreased, and we know it disrupted global value chain, international trade, economic activities. Especially the emphasis of UNIDO has been on the MSME sector, the micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, because it is there where we have the most vulnerable population, women and youth increasing, and this has led to increasing inequality. On the containment measures of workplace closure, the figures have been named. 2.5 billion workers all of a sudden without work, and a big migration into digital space. But as it was said, the inequalities, they relate precisely that not everybody could migrate, as we put it, into digital space, and only some of them could do it, and only some will benefit also to what comes next in terms of the notion of building back better, because for many countries it means building better and not building back. There was nothing that was there before. But what is important is to mention is the disruption arising from COVID-19 has accelerated ongoing mega trends, and the trends were ongoing: digitalization, automation of industry, what we call the fourth industrial revolution. It was already an ongoing process that was already affecting labor markets and productivity, and also it was something that we had a challenge on climate change already. So in specific, on the pandemic, UNIDO's response has been rescuing the MSMEs and the industrial ecosystems where the value creation happens, in order to generate or rescue employment and incomes for the household. So to support the member states, UNIDO has been following our core functions, in particular technical cooperation, policy analysis, and during the pandemic this could be enhanced norms and standards. Also, it was amazing that during the pandemic we could elaborate new standards, support the preparation of standards with our partners, and partnerships have become crucial because precisely in a world where we need tailored solution, we need to also make sure that we partner and we in order to protect the supply chain, the business sectors, and its employees. We have been launching an initiative called COVID-19 Industrial Recovery Program, addressing industrial sector from a national perspective as well as the national ecosystem. We have been providing also to the SMEs guidance just for business continuity. At the beginning, it was necessary to just keep the continuity on and the recovery, helping them to come back to the work safely. E-commerce strategy, 4IR related e-learning modules, and business investment plan development for supporting SMEs to access finance and strategy. So we have been accompanied defining our sectors in relation to their needs at the time. Manufacturing is evolving very quickly as a key component of service delivery in fighting the crisis, recovering from the effects, and bringing back to this normal to putting the MSCs at the core of the post-COVID recovery. So the relevance of our mandate has been reassured, building resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. And innovation is fundamental part of skills development. Without the skills development, we cannot have this necessary focus on innovation, this continuous learning. We cannot have continuously this support to innovation. And we have a unique position in UNIDO as we support structural transformation, digital transformation, and also circularity. So UNIDO is working with public-private partners, and this is also a very important lesson that we had, bringing the private sector. We have been doing it already, but we have seen that this is even stronger now than before. We have a platform called the Learning and Knowledge Development Facility, and it has a yearly forum, and this is helping us to precisely have a mechanism to do the knowledge sharing and the dialogue on the skills needed for a resilient future, and in order to move towards this global, inclusive, sustainable industrial development. At UNIDO, we have also been looking at technology foresight, which is very important, because if we know in which direction the specific sectors will move, we will know and we can anticipate regulatory needs, skills development needs, and the regional experiences in terms of the methodologies we can see for strategic decision making in the future. We have been in this regard also engaging with the G20 forum in relation to digitalization for strengthening the normative role and the mandate within digitalization which UNIDO has in this regard. Let me finalize saying that UNIDO has been recognized as a trusted knowledge partner of the G20 to ensure digital transformation leads to a sustainable and inclusive future for all. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Very, very interesting to have those different point of views. I'd like to turn to Martin Reiser from the World Bank. Martin, you are the World Bank's country director for China and Mongolia and Korea, and you have also therefore specific insight view on China, which, as we've heard, will be the next host. China wanted to host this competition and won the right to do so well before the pandemic, and their main interest in it was to promote careers and skills in the country. From your perspective, having heard what the minister said as well, what are the major challenges for China coming out of this pandemic? How has this COVID-19 crisis influenced the development of the country, and more especially affected vulnerable group as the youth? Because we've heard has been impacted. Has it been the same in China?
Thank you very much, Laurence, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you at this conference. Let me not repeat what others have said, just to emphasize that the World Bank's diagnostic is very consistent with what we heard from Guy Ryder in particular on the growing risk of a recovery that proceeds at very different speeds in the various parts of the world, and the particular impact that the pandemic has had on youth and their access to education and skills. But let me now turn to your question and China specifically. And I have to say that among the emerging markets or developing countries, China, of course, is in a bit of a different situation. China never had the kinds of large-scale outbreaks of COVID-19 inside the country that forced substantial and extended school closures. The economy is one of the few among the developing countries that has recovered just as robustly as in the advanced economies. In many ways, China was first in and first out of the pandemic in economic terms, and the GDP is likely to regain its pre-pandemic trend, i.e. Not just recover all of the output lost, but regain the lost ground in the course of this year. And so this is an important backdrop to what I'm going to say now. China in 2020, the onset of the pandemic, eradicated absolute poverty, measured by the number of people falling below the national poverty standard of about $2.3 per day. And this was, of course, a major achievement. However, the pandemic, I think, has drawn our attention to remaining challenges, despite of this achievement. The first is that the largest contribution to the reduction of poverty in China has come from economic growth. Indeed, inequality has increased during the last 4 decades, and even though it has plateaued over the last 10 years or so, it hasn't really declined. And this inequality is visible not just in economic outcomes, it is also, for instance, visible in access to education. So if you look at the difference between rural and urban residents in terms of completion of at least secondary education, there was a large gap around 10, 15 years ago, but the gap still hasn't completely disappeared. The same is true for tests of learning attainment, learning achievement, which show a substantial gap still between children with urban residency or rural residency, or children from parents with tertiary education among the father and parents with only primary education among the father. So these gaps are still there, and they risk becoming more permanent. Our analysis in the World Bank suggests that socioeconomic mobility in China has actually declined over the last 20 years. It was higher in the early part of the reform period than it is today. And that is in large measure because the family that you grow up in, the income that your family has, determines the educational opportunities that you have. This is clearly something that China wishes to address. There have been a number of reforms just announced in the past year that try to address these inequalities. But there's still, I think, a major challenge for China going forward. A final point that I would like to make regards China's future poverty reduction agenda. In this regard, China's poverty measures so far have really focused on the very poor. But if China were to adopt the poverty measure that is more in line with the kinds of poverty lines that we see in upper middle income countries, then still around 18% of the population, using, for instance, a suggested $5.50 poverty line that we use in the World Bank, would fall below that threshold. And of that 20% or so, about a third would be in urban areas. And a large number of those people are informal workers in urban areas that have been particularly hard hit by the pandemic. And so let me close by bringing those two thoughts together. The pandemic has affected China less. China has managed to eradicate absolute poverty precisely in the year of the pandemic, a major achievement. Yet when you adopt the poverty standard that is more in line with where China is in terms of economic development, then precisely the group that has been perhaps most negatively affected by the pandemic in China, namely informal urban workers that have become unemployed, are also the ones that feature more prominently in that group of vulnerable people. And so going forward, addressing inequalities in access to education and addressing the vulnerabilities of China's informal workers, including those in urban areas, are probably the key agendas for China going forward. And let me stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Interesting perspective. I think, as was mentioned, the recovery is not the same wherever you look in the globe. And if not affected by the pandemic, there still are lots of issues to sort out. Bernardo has mentioned already digitalization, and I think that we would all agree too that one of the effects of the pandemic has been an acceleration in the digital transformations, and also how they're used in terms of skills. I'd like to turn back to Nicholas Schmidt, because I know that we've heard what Bernardo, what UNIDO has been looking at in that respect. I know that that's also a topic that's at the heart of the work that the European Commission is doing. Could you tell us a bit, Nicholas, what the digitalization of education and work means for young people in Europe, and what this might imply for VET in the future from the perspective of Europe?
Thank you very much, Laurence. Yes, as you said, the pandemic has really accelerated the trend in digitalization, and especially digitalization under the form of digital learning, remote learning, and also remote working. And these were positive trends, because if we hadn't had the possibility of remote learning, we would have a major loss for young people, because they could not have finally continued studying, because a lot of at universities, but also at secondary schools, remote learning replaced the normal courses. But I must say also that what I hear from young people, they want to return to the classrooms. They want to return to universities. And this is also a very important issue, how we balance, on one hand, the remote learning, remote studying, and the more presence, the social component of studying. Because we all know that the psychological impact of this pandemic, through, by the way, isolation and so on, has got an important impact on the psychological impact on young people. So I think it's very important to return to some more balanced approach, combining remote and presence. This is the first thing. The second one is certainly an absolute need for opening and enlarging digital skills. Now, we know that most jobs now have some kind of digital component. And unfortunately, we still have in Europe a large portion of people, about 40, more than 40%, who do not have this digital skills. This is not absolutely the case for the young, because we notice that the young between 16 and 29, only 19% have no digital skills. But on the other hand, a lot of these young have not the digital skills for professional reasons. So there is a need for improving, enlarging their digital skills. In all areas, by the way, in all groups, there is this need, and especially also for vet students, because we know that all professions, including more traditional professions, are changing very rapidly and massively. And they are changing through the digitalization. The digital content in all these professions is increasing. And therefore, that has to change and to adapt to these new requests. And I think this is a very important element also for more cooperation, for enhancing innovation in that courses, in that curricula. And I think WorldSkills is the perfect approach to have this international cooperation, how to see how professions evolve, how we compare with our different systems, how we can increase the digital component of that education. So we have last year promoted, and the year before, very much that education. We have adopted a certain number of initiatives at the European level to really promote that at the European level. And there is a big and large and very strong request from member states to enhance their vet education. We know that in Europe we have some very good specialists in vet education, some countries having promoted very much their vet education for, I would say, for decades and even more. Some others are trailing behind, and everybody now understands that vet is probably a very adequate way to also to be integrated in this lifelong learning approach. And therefore, we are now pushing excellence in that, giving not only the young, but also adults the possibility to use this approach in terms of studying. And my last point is again on the international. We have put into place the famous Erasmus program for students mainly. but now we want also to promote the Erasmus system for apprentices, to give them precisely the possibility to get different experiences. And by the way, as Erasmus, there is Erasmus International going beyond the EU. Why not one day also having Erasmus for the apprentices, which has this international dimension that we have already in this WorldSkills competition. So I think that is the way how to learn for the future. If we manage to integrate, as it was said before, the innovative capacity into the VAT curricula. Thank you.
Thank you. Interesting perspective. And I'd like to, after that, turn back to Guy. We've just heard what's going on there in, again, a block of countries that can afford to look at digitization, help their members to move that forward. How do you, from the perspective of the ILO, think that what's going to be the impact of those new technologies, especially digitalization, on the current inequality that you mentioned earlier? How do you think that we can avoid how can we ensure that technology is adequately distributed so that the increase of new technology, use of new technology, does not end up increasing inequality?
Yeah, thanks very much. As I think my colleague from UNIDO said in his intervention, we were talking about digitalization of work and education before COVID-19 came along. It was happening already. But I think it's fair also to say that COVID-19 has been an accelerator. Now, we can draw some lessons from the experience of the last year and a half. On education, what did we see? Well, happily, a lot of students were able to migrate from face-to-face learning to remote learning methods, and that kept them going. But there was a very clear division of experience there. And here again, regrettably, this was the type of evolution that made inequalities worse, because, you know, whilst a large number of students did have the possibility, because they had digital connectivity, because they were in learning institutions that were able to adopt remote methodologies, they could keep going. But for a large number of students, and again, mostly in the less well-off countries, that wasn't the case. So their education was either interrupted, and we heard the figures right at the outset of our meeting, or even in situations of connectivity, people dropped out. They couldn't keep going. And that's one thing I think we have to bring into the equation here. The learning process, as has been said, is a social process. Educators matter, trainers matter, teachers matter, and the way they interact with students matter as well. So let's not think we can just leave it to the technology. We have to have human interaction in the learning process. And I would say something similar in terms of remote working. Now, many of us have been able to keep going because we could take our computer home and we could work not from the office, but from our living rooms in greater or lesser comfort, let's be honest. But that, again, is not the case for most workers. Most jobs in the world are not susceptible to being done remotely. My colleague from the World Bank mentioned, I'm pleased that he did, the informal economy, where still 6 out of 10 people earns a living today. Very, very rarely are those people able to engage in remote working. So you see, we are living in situations of a great diversity of experience. But my other point would be, there is a difference, a fundamental difference between what we have had to do because we've been living with a pandemic for the last year and a half and had to act accordingly, and what we might choose to do in the future. So most of us would want to come to Shanghai next October rather than sit and talk to each other on screen, wonderful though it is to see people on screen. There are human preferences about working collectively or remotely. Same is true for education. So this notion that, you know, there is a future out there waiting to happen to us is wrong. This is what I call the era of technological determinism when I'm feeling slightly pompous. We have choices to make. We have policies to adopt. And so if you ask me that question, which everybody asks, you know, will this fourth industrial revolution make our societies more unequal, or better? The answer inevitably is it depends on the policies we adopt to deal with them. It's not a very helpful answer, but it should encourage us all to not just sit back and wait for it to happen, but for make the outcomes that we want to happen actually happen. And there, inevitably, it's a lesson of history. Technology is a facilitator. It is an enabler. We have to learn to use it right.
Very interesting. Just a reminder to our audience that you can submit your questions and answers as well, as we're hoping to have a bit of time for questions from the audience. And Guy, just also bouncing back on another point that Nicolas made very well. What do you see are the chances for vets to fight poverty? Do you see, just as Nicolas mentioned, that vet will have a big role to play in getting us back where we should be?
Absolutely. It almost goes without saying. It's probably why I didn't say it. Clearly, skilling, reskilling, upskilling, it's part of positioning people to earn a decent livelihood, have a decent job in the future. And again, it's getting to sound like a little bit of a cliche. We have to move from just talking about lifelong learning as an ambition that we share to actually putting in place the delivery mechanisms. And I think the right to lifelong learning, it's there in the European Pillar of Social Rights, is a direction that we have to move in. But then we have to answer some difficult questions. Who is responsible for delivering on lifelong learning? Is it the state? Is it the employer? Is it the individual? Or probably a combination of all of those actors? Who's going to pay for it? And then the same menu of options comes up, because however great we are at the beginning of our educational career, it's an illusion now to believe that first we learn, then we work, then we retire. These sequential biographies of work are being overtaken by the speed of events. We have now intertwined biographies of work and learning, and eventually leisure, if we get a chance.
Thank you very much for that. Bernardo, you also mentioned earlier, building back better. I think it's a slogan we hear everywhere. We've now heard a bit about how VET can help build back better from the perspective of the European Commission, from the ILO. From your perspective, Bernardo, from UNIDO, from the SME's perspective, how do you see this build back better?
Thank you very much. And to follow and how the discussion is going, I really think we need to put an emphasis that we are in front of a paradigmatic change. And it was said the sequential way of following, learning, and then working and learning is changing. And in this world that is rapidly transforming digitally, the jobs in the future will be also coming and from digitalization. And from the point of view of UNIDO, we talk about the disruptive technologies that are revolutionizing manufacturing landscape. But when we talk about disruptive technologies, we need to unpack them. We need to see how this affects a specific technology and how it affects the specific country. There is no one size fit for all. We have seen we need to distinguish how things happen in the developing countries, but also if you go by region, there is a huge difference that is happening. We need to look what are the skills needed for AI and big data. Robotics is another skill set, 3D printing, blockchain, you name it. We have a number of elements to take into account, but the most important is that these are bringing opportunities, but these opportunities also are counterbalanced by many challenges, and the challenges relate precisely to social inclusion and the accessibility in developing countries to this digital sphere. So to build back better means that we need to focus from UNIDO point of view in inclusive industrial recovery, first of all, and the early planning of the skills that relate to these new sectors and technologies that will be adopted. Our emphasis obviously is again on youth, women, and the SMEs. But what we have seen also, and I repeat it, is that during the pandemic, the explosion of the use of our online platform. So this future will be based on, we have the UNIDO Knowledge Hub, the Training Academy, the Industrial Analytic Platforms, and the LKDF platform, and all this has been exploding over the time. And this is what is important to see, that we will need to have different types of tools, and this new normal will be different. The skills development will be digital, and we will create it in particular to focus on young people. But one aspect I would like to especially put an emphasis when we talk about no one is left behind is the issue of women and the issue of gender, because it is unacceptable that women still today are left behind in the digital divide as a global workforce. The digital gender divide is even wider in STEM, and only 35% of women graduate in these subjects are higher education level. So to build back better, in UNIDO, we are putting a strong emphasis on our strategy for gender equality, empowerment of women, which highlights the role of ICTs and digital technologies for empowering women in industrial development. And again, the partnership with the private sector for us is important. We have a partnership with Hewlett and Packard in supporting women in 32 countries obtaining qualifications, requalification in ICTs, entrepreneurship through vocational training programs and online platforms. So in a nutshell, this is very important for us, is to put an emphasis, but then we need to unpack and go to the specific. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think Mr. Schmidt will have to leave us a bit early, so thank you very much, Niklas, for joining us, and just please do step out when you need to. I would like to turn back to Martin as well, in view of all the discussions we've had. How do you see VET in China? How do you see this, the importance? We've heard the emphasis that the government's putting on it. What do you think does the future look like for VET there? And I think there's one thing we haven't mentioned yet, because we will have a panel discussion during this conference program about bringing green skills to curriculums. So also there, the question, is there any awareness as well in VET around green skills, green jobs in China?
First of all, thank you, Laurence. First of all, I would say there's huge opportunity in green jobs. China already today employs more people in green and renewable energy industries than in the coal sector, by a margin of, I think, 2 to 1. So this is clearly the sector that will grow. China's climate commitments will require significant further tightening of policies, and that will require a shift of labor from carbon-intensive to greener industries. I think Guy Ryder already talked about the importance that lifelong learning and retraining and reskilling of workers is going to play. That was not your question, but I just wanted to emphasize it, because if we take the green transition seriously, this is going to be a process of significant structural change, and it will affect today's generation of workers as much as tomorrow's generation of workers. So we need to have those measures of reskilling, retraining, labor market activation in place. Turning to the youth, I think China has had a remarkable success in expanding access to technical and vocational education. We've been involved in some of that, and it has clearly led to significant improvements in the access to more years of education for Chinese youth, including in rural areas, including in less advanced provinces. And this has been one of the factors that's been driving the closing gap in education between rural and urban areas. However, I think the quality of technical and vocational education has been quite variable. This is one of the things that we have been quite involved in our work with Chinese provinces, is to introduce performance measurement, to introduce new curricula, to introduce new teaching methods in the classroom, to make sure that students don't just go to school, but actually come out with additional learning. And I think on that front, there's still quite an important agenda that remains to be traveled. One of the challenges that we have is that we don't have school-based comparative statistics that would allow us to carry out some of this analysis on more robust empirical grounds. But we do find from our own project experience that the kinds of interventions we have supported have made a significant difference. Now, let me close on two more observations. The first is that the digitalization of the world is going to require strengthening the kinds of skills that computers can't replace humans doing. And those are likely to be more in the socio-emotional area than in the purely technical area. And I think if we want to get ready for the digital world, we need to pay attention to those aspects of learning. And that speaks for a more interactive form of teaching. That speaks to the kind of modern teaching methods that, for instance, Shanghai, and since we are going to be hosted by Shanghai, let me mention this, has introduced in its own education system that has allowed the Shanghai students to rank top at the PISA assessments in recent years. And then the final observation on green skills, on getting ready for the greening of the economy. I do think, parents as well as teachers in schools have a big role to play in instilling greater awareness of the environment in young people. When I look at my own children, they remind me regularly of the need for more consciousness with respect to my carbon footprint, with respect to recycling, with respect to generally being environmentally aware. I think the same is likely to be true for the next generation of Chinese that are going to grow up in an environmentally challenged way. Schools can support this in an important way. And this is not just about the technical skills that are needed for green industries, those are important, but also, again, about the socio-emotional skills and the general awareness that schools can instill. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think we've learned a lot today, the importance of partnerships, unequal recovery and what can be done, the importance of lifelong learning, digitization and the gap that needs to be closed there as well. And there's lots of things that we can discuss over the next few days. So I'd like to finish off by turning back to Ivy. You've now heard what all our experts have said, and you got much broader perspective than just your own experience. So what would you say are your expectations from the policymakers in the room today, especially when you look for the next 12 months in the run-up to Shanghai as a young person?
Well, thank you very much. Well, first of all, I would like to say thank you to WorldSkills China and WorldSkills International for leading this conversation. It is not only addressing many issues for young people are facing now, but also including us in the conversation. Each of you that participate of the conference has the power to make young people's lives better. So my appreciation for caring about us, our young generation. WorldSkills competition and this conference provide wonderful platforms for us. As a former WorldSkills competitor, Asian representative of the WorldSkills Champion Trust, and a Chinese girl, I would like to say that women are always full of resilience and courage. Even there's a long way to go for closing the gender gap, I still firmly believe that skills could achieve gender equality. And I hope that more women can benefit from learning skills and be happier through mastering skills. And at the same time, we all realize the importance of the global action to resolve the climate crisis. This is the most pressing issue for our future, and we will change ourselves after COVID-19. Climate change pushes industry transformation. Some industry may be gone, some industry may be newly emerged. These are all need skilled people, study and master green skills. Never stop learning, never stop challenging ourselves. We need to create future for ourselves. Let us pursue our dream of skills, then pay back to the world. And dear all my friends, lastly, I would like to say, master skills change the world. I'm looking forward to seeing you all in Shanghai in October 2022. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ivy. And I think I will shortly hand over to Hao Bing, the DG of International Affairs of the Ministry of Labour. But before I do that, just a reminder to all of you that we have 3 parallel sessions following this panel discussion today. They will be starting at 5:15 China Standard Time. The conference program runs every day until Friday. The registrations are still open because no one needs to travel. You're all welcome to join us. And we will be on Friday giving some conclusions and a review of the sessions to serve as an outlook, as I mentioned, for our conference next year in 2022. And I encourage you all to join because we'll be treated as well to a virtual tour of the WorldSkills Museum that Shanghai has been building in preparation for next year. So before I hand over to Mr. Hao Bing, I would like to thank all our speakers today and our conference coalition partners for making this possible. Thank you all for joining us today for very, very interesting discussions. And I hope you will be joining us next year in Shanghai during the WorldSkills competition. So Mr. Bin, I'll hand over to you for the final word.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cates. Greetings from Beijing to the Director General, Ryder, and Commissioner Smith, and all the distinguished participants to this very important and launching of this meeting. My minister, Minister Zhang, before he left the meeting and went to another important meeting, asked me to say words of great appreciation to the Director General, to the Commissioner, to the Honorable Representative from the UNIDO and World Bank, all the distinguished participants for their great contribution to this very important and kickoff meeting. And the fact that you, the honorable and distinguished participant, attended this session demonstrate not only the friendship that you to the Chinese, to China, but also more importantly, your great importance that you attached to the global skill movement. And it is the movement that have a great bearing for the future. So a very, very deep thank you very much from the minister, on behalf of the minister, to you, Commissioner, Director General, distinguished representatives from the international community, and also, of course, last but not least, our very able chairperson who so ably chaired this session, and also thank you very much to you and to the Secretariat as well, and the WorldSkills organization. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and that concludes our session today. So thank you very much, everyone. We wish you a nice day, evening, good night, depending on where you are around the globe. We hope to see you in the sessions later on, in the sessions over the next few days. And once again, thank you, and hopefully see you at the WorldSkills competition in Shanghai in 2022. Thank you.